Elizabeth Taylor was one of the most famous women in Hollywood history. For decades, the world watched her on the big screen. People admired her beauty, followed her extraordinary career, talked about her marriages, and became fascinated by the glamorous life that seemed to surround her. But behind the cameras, behind the diamonds, behind the red carpets and magazine covers, there was another side of Elizabeth Taylor. She was a mother. And her story as a mother is one of the most personal chapters of her life. Elizabeth Taylor had 4 children. Michael Wilding Jr., Christopher Wilding, Liza Todd, and Maria Burton. 4 children who grew up in a world that was anything but ordinary. Their mother was not simply a successful actress. She was a global celebrity. Her name was recognized almost everywhere. And as they grew up, her fame became part of their lives as well. But each of Elizabeth Taylor's children would eventually have to answer the same question. Who am I beyond my mother's famous name? To understand that question, we have to go back to the beginning. Elizabeth Taylor was born in London in 1932. Her family later moved to the United States, where her extraordinary appearance and natural talent quickly attracted attention. Hollywood discovered her while she was still very young. She began appearing in films and gradually became one of the industry's most recognizable young stars. As Elizabeth's career grew, so did the attention surrounding her personal life. Her relationships became news. Her marriages became headlines. And eventually, motherhood became another important part of her story. In 1953, Elizabeth welcomed her first child, Michael Wilding Jr., during her marriage to British actor Michael Wilding. For Elizabeth, this was the beginning of a completely different chapter. She was no longer only an actress. She was a mother. 2 years later, in 1955, Elizabeth had her second son, Christopher Wilding. Now she had 2 young boys growing up while her own career was becoming increasingly successful. But life inside the Taylor family was never completely private. Elizabeth was becoming a major Hollywood star, and photographers and journalists were increasingly interested in everything she did. For her children, this meant growing up with a mother whose life was constantly being watched by the public. Then Elizabeth met producer Mike Todd. Their relationship became an important and deeply emotional chapter in her life. In 1957, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Frances Todd, better known as Liza Todd. For a time, Elizabeth appeared to have found happiness with Mike Todd and their growing family. But that happiness would be followed by devastating tragedy. In 1958, Mike Todd died in a plane crash. Elizabeth was left to face an enormous personal loss. Her daughter Liza was still a baby. Michael and Christopher were also still young. To the public, Elizabeth Taylor was a famous actress dealing with tragedy. But inside the family, she was simply a mother trying to continue raising her children after losing someone she loved. The tragedy became one of the defining moments of Elizabeth's life. And it also became part of the story her children would carry with them. Soon afterward, another major chapter began. Elizabeth Taylor's relationship with actor Richard Burton became one of the most famous romances in Hollywood history. Their relationship fascinated the world. Their chemistry was undeniable, their personalities were powerful, and their private lives were constantly discussed in the media. But for Elizabeth's children, Richard Burton was more than a famous actor. He became part of their family. During this period, Elizabeth and Richard also adopted a young girl named Maria. Maria became Elizabeth Taylor's 4th child. And now Elizabeth had 4 children from different chapters of her life. Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria. Their backgrounds were different. Their personalities were different. And eventually, their lives would take very different directions. But they all shared one extraordinary experience. They grew up as the children of Elizabeth Taylor. That meant living with a level of fame that most people could never imagine. When Elizabeth appeared in public, cameras followed her. When she entered a relationship, newspapers talked about it. When her family changed, the the public wanted to know why. For her children, fame was not something they could simply turn off. It was part of their childhood. But there was an important difference between the Elizabeth Taylor the world knew and the Elizabeth Taylor her children knew. To millions of people, she was a Hollywood legend. To her children, she was their mother. They saw the woman behind the photographs. They experienced the private moments that the public never saw. They watched her deal with happiness, loss, relationships, career pressures, and the enormous expectations that came with being Elizabeth Taylor. As the four children grew older, they began creating lives of their own. Michael Wilding Jr. developed a connection to the entertainment world. Christopher Wilding also pursued a career connected to film and television. Liza Todd developed her own creative identity through art. And Maria Burton eventually chose a more private path. Their lives were different, but they all faced the same unusual challenge. They had to build their own identities while carrying one of the most famous names in Hollywood. Being Elizabeth Taylor's child could open doors. But it could also create expectations. People might compare them to their mother. They might judge them through the lens of her fame. And sometimes, the hardest part of being born into a legendary family is proving that you are more than the name you inherited. Elizabeth Taylor's children would each deal with that challenge in their own way. And as they became adults, their relationship with their mother also changed. The little children who once depended on Elizabeth eventually became adults with careers, relationships, and families of their own. Elizabeth herself entered a different stage of life. She was no longer only a Hollywood star. She was a mother. A grandmother. And eventually, a great-grandmother. The world continued to see the glamorous Elizabeth Taylor. But inside her family, her greatest role was becoming increasingly simple. She was mom. And that is where the story of her four children truly begins. Because behind one of Hollywood's most famous women were four people trying to build lives of their own. For children who grew up surrounded by fame. For children who witnessed both the extraordinary privileges and the complicated realities of being part of Elizabeth Taylor's family. And in the next chapter, we will look at her first two children in greater detail. Michael Wilding Jr. and Christopher Wilding. Two sons who grew up during some of the most dramatic years of their mother's life. And who had to discover who they were beyond the shadow of one of Hollywood's greatest legends. For the first two children of Elizabeth Taylor, growing up was never going to be ordinary. Michael Wilding Jr. and Christopher Wilding were born into a world of Hollywood lights, famous names, photographers, and constant public attention. But behind all of that was something much simpler. They were two brothers growing up with their mother. Michael Wilding Jr. was born in 1953 during Elizabeth Taylor's marriage to British actor Michael Wilding. At the time, Elizabeth was already becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable young actresses. Her career was moving quickly. Her face was appearing on magazine covers. And her name was becoming known around the world. But at home, Elizabeth had another responsibility. She was raising her first child. For Michael, Elizabeth Taylor was not the glamorous movie star that millions of people admired. She was simply his mother. 2 years later, in 1955, Elizabeth welcomed her second son, Christopher Wilding. Now the family had two young boys. Michael and Christopher were growing up together while their mother's fame continued to rise. Their father, Michael Wilding, was also an actor, meaning the boys were surrounded by the entertainment industry from the very beginning. Hollywood was not something they discovered later in life. It was part of their childhood. But being surrounded by fame did not mean their family life was always easy. Elizabeth's marriage to Michael Wilding eventually came to an end. And the boys had to grow up while their mother's personal life continued to change. Elizabeth later married producer Mike Todd. A daughter, Liza, was born in 1957. For a brief period, Elizabeth's family seemed to be entering a happier chapter. But in 1958, tragedy struck. Mike Todd died in a plane crash. Elizabeth was devastated. Her children were still very young, and suddenly their family had to deal with an enormous loss. For Michael and Christopher, their mother was no longer simply the famous actress they saw surrounded by cameras. They were seeing the personal side of her life. They were seeing a mother dealing with grief while still having to care for her children. And all of this was happening while the public continued watching. That was one of the unusual realities of growing up in Elizabeth Taylor's family. Even moments that should have been private could become public stories. Then another major figure entered their lives. Richard Burton. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton became one of the most talked about couples in the world. Their relationship was passionate, complicated, and constantly followed by the media. They married, divorced, and later married again. To the public, their relationship was a legendary Hollywood romance. But to Elizabeth's children, Richard Burton was also part of their family life. Michael and Christopher grew up during this extraordinary period. Their home life was connected to people whose names were already famous around the world. And yet, childhood still had its ordinary moments. They had to grow up. They had to attend school. They had to discover their interests. And eventually, they had to decide what they wanted to do with their lives. For Michael Wilding Jr., the entertainment world became a natural direction. He entered acting and appeared in film and television projects. But becoming an actor with Elizabeth Taylor as your mother was not necessarily simple. The moment people heard his name, they knew exactly who his mother was. That meant comparisons were almost unavoidable. People could look at him and see Elizabeth Taylor's son before they saw Michael Wilding Jr. himself. That is a difficult position for anyone trying to establish an independent career. Instead of starting with a completely unknown name, Michael began with a name that already carried enormous expectations. He had to prove himself as an individual. Christopher Wilding also developed a connection to the entertainment industry. He worked in acting and filmmaking, building a career of his own. Like his older brother, Christopher had grown up surrounded by cinema. But he also faced the same reality. His family name was already famous. His mother was one of the most recognizable actresses in the world. So his own achievements could easily be viewed through the shadow of her success. For both brothers, finding independence was important. They were not simply trying to escape their mother's fame. They were trying to establish their own identities. And that is a major difference. Elizabeth Taylor's fame was part of their history. They could never completely separate themselves from it. But they could decide what to do with it. As Michael and Christopher became adults, their relationship with their mother also changed. They were no longer little boys depending on Elizabeth for everything. They became adults with their own careers and personal lives. Eventually, they also became fathers themselves. And Elizabeth Taylor gained another role. Grandmother. This was an important change in Elizabeth's life. For decades, the world had watched her as an actress. Then as a celebrity. Then as one of Hollywood's most famous personalities. But inside her family, she was becoming the center of a growing generation. Her sons were creating families of their own. And Elizabeth was watching her children become parents. The relationship between a mother and her adult children is different from the relationship they have as children. There comes a point when the parent is no longer guiding every decision. Instead, the family becomes a group of adults who share history. For Elizabeth, that history was extraordinary. Her children had witnessed some of the most dramatic moments of her life. They had seen her relationships change. They had experienced family losses. They had watched her career continue. And they had grown up while the whole world watched their mother. Yet through all of it, Elizabeth remained their mother first. The public could debate her marriages. The media could discuss her lifestyle. Fans could admire her movies. But her children knew a side of her that existed outside the headlines. This is why the story of Michael and Christopher is important. Their lives show that being the child of a celebrity can be complicated. There can be opportunities. There can be privilege. But there can also be pressure. When your parent is famous, people may expect you to follow the same path. They may expect you to become successful in the same industry. They may expect you to live up to a family legacy. Michael and Christopher had to decide for themselves how much of that legacy they wanted to carry. And both found ways to create lives beyond simply being known as Elizabeth Taylor's sons. But the story of Elizabeth Taylor's children does not end with her two sons. Her third child would take a very different path. Liza Todd was born into one of the happiest periods of Elizabeth's life with Mike Todd. But she would also grow up carrying the memory of a father she lost when she was still very young. As an adult, Liza would choose creativity and art rather than simply following her mother's path into Hollywood. Her story would become another example of how Elizabeth Taylor's children built identities of their own. And that is where the story continues. With Liza Todd. Elizabeth Taylor's third child was a daughter named Elizabeth Frances Todd, better known as Liza Todd. Her story began during one of the most important and emotional chapters of Elizabeth Taylor's life. Liza was born in 1957 to Elizabeth Taylor and producer Mike Todd. At that time, Elizabeth was experiencing a period of great happiness. She had become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, but her relationship with Mike Todd brought something different into her life. Family. For Elizabeth, Liza was not simply another child. She was the daughter of a man Elizabeth deeply loved. But Liza's childhood would soon be marked by a tragedy that changed her family forever. In 1958, when Liza was still a baby, her father Mike Todd died in a plane crash. Suddenly, Elizabeth was left to raise her young children while dealing with an enormous personal loss. Liza was too young to understand what had happened. She would grow up without the opportunity to truly know her father as an adult. Instead, much of her connection to him would come through family memories, photographs, and the stories people told about the man who had been so important to her mother. And this became one of the defining elements of Liza's childhood. She was the daughter of a famous Hollywood producer. Her mother was one of the world's biggest actresses. Yet her childhood also carried the absence of her father. As Liza grew older, she was surrounded by an extraordinary family environment. Her mother continued working in Hollywood. Elizabeth's relationships continued to attract enormous public attention. And the Taylor family remained a subject of interest for the media. But Liza eventually had to find her own place within that world. She could have chosen to follow her mother directly into acting. She could have attempted to build a career in front of the cameras. Instead, she developed her own connection with the world of art. Liza became known as an artist and sculptor. This decision was important. Because it gave her something that belonged entirely to her. She was not trying to become another Elizabeth Taylor. She was creating her own identity. And perhaps that was one of the most powerful things any child of a legendary celebrity could do. Build something that is yours. For Liza, creativity became that path. Art allowed her to express herself without having to compete with her mother's enormous Hollywood legacy. She could be Liza Todd. Not simply Elizabeth Taylor's daughter. That distinction became increasingly important as she grew older. Because being the child of a celebrity can sometimes mean living with an identity that other people have already created for you. People see your surname. They know your parents. They know your family's history. And they may believe they already know who you are. But Liza's life showed that a famous family name does not have to determine your future. She could respect her family's history while still choosing a different direction. And her relationship with art became an important part of that independence. As an adult, Liza also became a mother herself. This created another connection between her and Elizabeth. Elizabeth Taylor was no longer only raising children. She was now watching her own children become parents. And that meant Elizabeth's family continued to grow across generations. For Elizabeth, becoming a grandmother offered another kind of family experience. The world might have continued to see her as a glamorous Hollywood icon. But her family saw another side of her. The mother. The grandmother. The person who existed beyond the cameras. Liza's journey also kept the memory of Mike Todd alive in another way. Although she had lost her father when she was extremely young, his place in the family story never disappeared. Mike Todd remained an important part of Elizabeth Taylor's history. And through Elizabeth, his memory remained connected to Liza's own identity. But Liza did not allow that history to define everything about her. She built her own life. She developed her own interests. And she created a career based on creativity rather than celebrity. That choice is significant because Elizabeth Taylor's children were constantly surrounded by fame. They could have easily remained inside that world. But not all of them wanted the same thing. Some moved toward entertainment. Some chose art. And some preferred a quieter existence. Liza's path showed that independence can sometimes mean choosing something completely different from what people expect. Her story also reveals something about Elizabeth Taylor herself. Elizabeth had spent her entire life in front of cameras. She knew what fame could give a person. She also knew what fame could take away. Privacy. Normality. And sometimes the freedom to simply make mistakes without the whole world watching. Her children had grown up seeing this reality. So perhaps it was natural that some of them would want to create lives where their own identity mattered more than their mother's celebrity. Liza's artistic life became one example of that. She carried the Taylor name. She carried her family's history. But she also carried something that was uniquely hers. Her own creativity. Her own choices. Her own life. And that is what makes Liza Todd's story different from the Hollywood fairy tale people might expect. She wasn't trying to recreate her mother's career. She wasn't trying to become another Elizabeth Taylor. She was simply trying to become herself. But there was still one more child whose story was different from all the others. Elizabeth Taylor's fourth child was Maria Burton. Maria joined the family through adoption and grew up surrounded by Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Her story would reveal another side of Elizabeth's understanding of family. Because sometimes, family is not only about where you come from. It is also about the people who choose to become your family. And Maria's story would bring the Taylor family into its final chapter. Elizabeth Taylor's life was filled with extraordinary moments. She became a Hollywood star while she was still young. She appeared in some of the most memorable films of her generation. She experienced incredible success. She became one of the world's most recognizable women. Her relationships became famous. Her jewelry became legendary. And her name became permanently connected with Hollywood history. But when the cameras disappeared and the headlines faded, there was another part of Elizabeth Taylor's life that mattered just as much. Her 4 children. Michael Wilding Jr. Christopher Wilding. Liza Todd. And Maria Burton. Their lives were very different. But all 4 shared the experience of growing up with a mother whose fame was almost impossible to escape. 4 children, 4 different paths. Michael Wilding Jr. was Elizabeth's first child. He grew up during the early years of her extraordinary Hollywood career. As he became an adult, he developed a connection with the entertainment industry himself. But he also had to establish his own identity. He was not simply Michael Wilding Jr. To the public, he was Elizabeth Taylor's son. That label could never completely disappear. Christopher Wilding faced a similar situation. He also became connected to acting and filmmaking. But his career and personal life belonged to him. He was not simply a reflection of his mother. He was building his own story. Then there was Liza Todd. Liza's story was different. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd, and she lost her father when she was still a baby. As she grew older, she chose creativity and art as part of her own identity. She did not need to follow her mother's exact path. She found another way to express herself. And then there was Maria Burton. Maria joined Elizabeth's family through adoption. Her journey showed another side of Elizabeth's life. Family was not only about biological connections. For Elizabeth, family could also be created through love, responsibility, and choice. Maria eventually maintained a much more private life than her famous mother. And that choice was significant. Not every child of a celebrity wants to live in the spotlight. Some people want the freedom to simply be themselves. The price of a famous name. There is something people often forget when they look at celebrity families. Fame can look beautiful from the outside. It can mean luxury, travel, opportunity, access to places most people never see. But fame can also bring pressure. When your parent is one of the most famous people in the world, people may expect you to be extraordinary too. They may compare your achievements to your parents' achievements. They may judge you before they even know you. And your family history can become part of your identity before you are old enough to choose it. Elizabeth Taylor's children had to navigate that reality. They inherited one of the most famous surnames in Hollywood. But they also inherited a family history filled with complicated relationships, enormous success, tragedy, and constant public attention. The question was never whether they were Elizabeth Taylor's children. Everyone already knew that. The real question was, who would they become for themselves? And each child answered that question differently. Elizabeth the mother. Perhaps the most interesting part of this entire story is that Elizabeth Taylor was never only one thing. To the world, she was an actress. To Hollywood, she was an icon. To the fashion world, she was a symbol of glamour. To the humanitarian world, she became an important advocate. But to her 4 children, she was their mother. That means they experienced a side of Elizabeth that the public could never fully see. They knew the person behind the famous photographs. They knew the woman who had her own fears and emotions. They saw her during moments of happiness. They saw her during moments of loss. They watched her relationships change. And they watched her become older. For decades, the public remained fascinated by Elizabeth Taylor's beauty. But time eventually changed everything. The young actress became an older woman. Her children became adults. Her family expanded. And the center of her life gradually moved away from the Hollywood spotlight. A different kind of legacy. Elizabeth Taylor's legacy is often discussed through her films. Her performances remain part of cinema history. Her awards remain part of her professional achievements. Her jewelry collection became famous around the world. And her humanitarian work became another important part of her story. But there was another legacy. Her children. Through them, Elizabeth's family continued into another generation. The little boys and girls who once grew up around Hollywood became adults. They created families of their own. And eventually, Elizabeth became a grandmother and great-grandmother. This was a remarkable transformation. The world had spent decades watching Elizabeth Taylor become famous. But her family was watching something different. They were watching a mother grow older. They were watching a woman who had lived through extraordinary highs and devastating lows. And they were watching the person they knew personally become a part of history. Elizabeth Taylor's final chapter. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, at the age of 79. Her death was reported around the world. Hollywood mourned. Fans remembered her films. And generations of people reflected on the extraordinary life she had lived. But for her children, the loss was deeply personal. They were not saying goodbye to a Hollywood icon. They were saying goodbye to their mother. That is an important difference. The world lost Elizabeth Taylor, the legend. Her family lost Elizabeth, the person they knew away from the cameras. And after her death, her legacy continued. Her films remained. Her humanitarian work remained. Her name remained. But most importantly, her family remained. What her 4 children tell us about Elizabeth Taylor. When we look at the lives of Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria, we see 4 different stories. Michael and Christopher experienced the entertainment world in their own ways. Liza found her own identity through art and creativity. Maria chose a more private path. None of them became another Elizabeth Taylor. And perhaps that was never supposed to happen. A child is not meant to become a copy of their parent. They are meant to become themselves. Elizabeth Taylor gave the world an unforgettable career. But she also gave her children something more personal. A family history. Memories. Experiences. And a connection to a woman whose life was anything but ordinary. Her children inherited her name. But they also had to build their own identities. And that is what makes their story so fascinating. Because behind the legendary actress was a mother. Behind the Hollywood icon was a family. And behind the headlines were 4 children trying to live their own lives. The woman behind the legend. Elizabeth Taylor will always be remembered. Her face will continue to appear in photographs. Her films will continue to introduce new generations to her talent. Her name will remain part of Hollywood history. But perhaps the most human way to remember her is not through the diamonds or the fame. It is through the people who knew her differently. Her 4 children. Michael. Christopher. Liza. And Maria. They remind us that even the most famous people in the world have private lives. They have families. They have responsibilities. They experience love. They experience loss. And eventually, they grow old just like everyone else. Elizabeth Taylor spent much of her life in front of the world's eyes. But her most personal legacy was created away from the cameras. It was created through her family. 4 children. 4 different lives. 1 unforgettable mother. And perhaps that is the story people should remember. Not only Elizabeth Taylor, the Hollywood legend. But Elizabeth Taylor, the mother behind the legend.